Good morning and welcome, everyone. My name is Emily Prey, and I'm a senior analyst for special initiatives at the Newlines Institute. As a part of Newlines' webinar series, I'm delighted to be speaking with Dr. Susan Martin about her most recent edition of her book, A Nation of Immigrants. Dr. Susan Martin is the Donald G. Hertzberg Professor Emerita of International Migration in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She was the founder and director of Georgetown's Institute for the Study of International Migration. She also chairs the thematic working group on environmental change and migration for the Knowledge Partnership in Migration and Development at the World Bank. Prior to joining Georgetown's faculty, Dr. Martin was the executive director of the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform, which was mandated by statute to advise the President and Congress on U.S. immigration and refugee policy. I'd like to encourage the audience to ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen or the comment section on YouTube. And you can follow us on Twitter at Newlines, INST, or subscribe to our YouTube channel to keep up to date on events. Thank you so much for joining me. Susan, it's a pleasure to have you here. So your book your book delves into the history of immigration to the United States and looks at different models of immigration over the years. So how important is it for policymakers in Washington to understand this history when they're making laws and enacting policies on immigration?
I think it's very important, and mostly because the historical background and the evolution of U.S. policy helps provide context for current developments and also current attitudes about immigration. There's often a tendency for Americans to think with rose-colored glasses about their own immigrant forebears. They came and they made a great country, and that's true. But throughout history, we've always been very suspicious of the immigrants who are coming in at the time that we're alive, and have had the same doubts about immigrants from the very beginning, from the colonial period onward. And to understand that there's this give and take all of the time between what the ideal is, what we think is the notion of what it means to be a nation of immigrants, and the reality over time of how we have managed migration and what we have thought about immigrants helps us put into context what is occurring in the present day.
And throughout the book, you make clear that at times the U.S. has been pro-immigration but anti-immigrant. And I think this is a really significant point. So can you explain what you mean by this?
Sure. There are three different models that are effectively pro-immigration that began in the colonial period, and the book goes through some detail of how they emerged and what they mean. And they continue to be important for the United States as we move forward. The Virginia model, which was the first one, welcomed immigrants, but they welcomed them as cheap exploitable labor in many ways. First as of people who came under contract, and then convict labor, and eventually it took the form of slavery. And we've seen that as we move forward, that we've admitted guest workers, we admitted the Chinese to come in to help build the railroad, but then took steps to deny them rights and didn't treat them as full citizens. Our current large-scale tolerance, I'd say, over the last few decades for unauthorized migration, because we want that type of labor, is a manifestation of the Virginia model. Then the Massachusetts model, also very welcoming of newcomers, but only if they shared the beliefs and theology of the majority of the people who had formed the colony. When they deviated, as did Roger Williams or Anne Hutchinson, whose stories I tell in the book, then they were likely to be expelled from the colony. And in the worst case example, with a number of Quakers including women, when they returned, they were executed. We see this again throughout our history with the anti-anarchist, anti-communist, anti-terrorist provisions in our law that are often needed because of the security constraints under which the country is operating, but are often overdone, and people who are not associated with any kind of violent movements are also held in a very difficult situation. It's really only the third model, the Pennsylvania model, where there is a coincidence between a pro-immigration policy and a pro-immigrant policy. When people were invited to the colony because of their diversity, because they were seen as potential citizens and were treated as such. And I argue in the book that this is the model we should aspire to maintain. But anytime there's a suspicion of whether immigrants are integrating, we tend to unleash the fourth model that I talk about in the book, and which is anti-immigration and anti-immigrant, and is based on nativism and xenophobia. And again, it goes back to the colonial periods, and we've seen manifestations most recently during the Trump administration of this model of immigration.
So speaking of pro-immigration but anti-immigrant, the US is a country that was built on the backs of slaves. And slavery, as you mentioned, is a very extreme version, to put it lightly, of the Virginia model of immigration, which wants cheap workers without welcoming them into the community. And over the last several decades, there's been an upsurge in unauthorized immigration, where most newcomers entered outside the legal framework. And a lot of these migrants are coming from Central or South America. They're low-wage workers who do bring positive benefits to our economy, but the US has time and time again made it very difficult for them to get full citizenship. So the US has survived and thrived at times on the forced and low-wage labor of Black and brown bodies while denying full membership in US society. What needs to happen for the immigration system to value their membership in US society as much as it values their labor?
Well, the last time we were really facing this type of an extreme anti-immigrant sentiment was in the period of the time from the 1930s to the 1960s. And where we had national origins quotas allowed people to come in, for example, the braceros from Mexico as temporary workers, but again, with almost no rights that they could claim. And in the context of the overall civil rights movement, as it developed in the late 50s and then into the 1960s, there were steps taken to shift immigration towards what I refer to as the Pennsylvania model. And that was to eliminate the Bracero program, which had its own negative impacts, because that was part of the reason that unauthorized migration began to grow so strongly, because there was no substitute for the entry of low-wage workers. But we reformed our legal immigration system to be more inclusive, to allow people from other countries to come in regardless of what their national origins were, as long as they were going to become good residents and citizens of the United States. And I think that we're in that situation again today. I think that we can't do immigration reform in a vacuum. It has to be part of something that really gets, quote, some of the things that President Biden said during the campaign. It really has to get at the soul of America. And I think that after the incidents last summer, the demonstrations, the new focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and figuring out ways to include people of color people who may be of lower educational status, people who are working in low-wage jobs into the community. I think that's the context in which we should be thinking about where we want our immigration policy to go. And our immigration policy needs to reflect the best elements of that commitment that we've been struggling towards to promote diversity, inclusion, and equity. And without that, it's going to be really, really difficult to do a meaningful reform of US immigration, because we'll be perpetuating the problems of yesterday rather than thinking about them in some new means, where we set priorities and really welcome people into our midst.
I think one of the big takeaways for me from the book was that the immigration system is ever changing. It's very convoluted and confusing and rather dependent on which party is in power. So how can immigrants navigate this system, especially when many of them might not even speak English?
It's hard. I am often asked, I'm not an attorney, I'm an historian, as you can tell from the way in which I've been speaking, but I've been a public policy expert for about 40 years working on these issues. And I'm often asked for immigration legal advice, or what do I do with my situation? And I always say, you have to go see a lawyer, do not do it yourself, and don't get advice from people who are not steeped in immigration law, because it is so complex. There are so many pitfalls. It is so difficult to navigate those systems. I think the majority of people who want to come to the US want to come legally. And in fact, I quarrel a little bit with something you said earlier, Emily. It's that illegal or undocumented migration hasn't been actually the largest numbers of people. The largest numbers of people coming in are still coming in or gaining legal status. And that's the way we want people to enter. I'm actually something of a hawk on unauthorized migration. I think that we need to take steps to reduce it significantly. Those steps were taken during the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations. They kind of got reversed during the Trump administration with the fixation on the wall. But the reason that I feel that we have to reduce unauthorized migration is because it undermines our legal admission system. If people have a way of going around it, that's problematic. But even more so, the problem is that it's very harmful for the immigrants themselves, that they take tremendous risk coming in. So I think at the foundation, we have to reform our legal system so it meets priorities. If there is a demand for a certain type of labor, that we are able to address it through legal means and not relying on people coming in illegally in order to be able to fill those jobs, and to provide some rights to the people who are there and pathways to permanent residence. So I think we need a new Americanization program. That was something that occurred during the very early part of the 20th century. It eventually morphed into a more coercive concept, but initially the idea was that there was an obligation on the part of the government and on the part of local communities to help immigrants to integrate, to provide them access to language training, to skills training, to help ensure that their children did well in school, to ensure that ethnic enclaves were a place that could thrive but didn't become ghettos that forced people into communities without any opportunities elsewhere. And that's really what we need today in order to make sure that we can benefit the most from immigration. And that should be led by immigrants. They should be setting the agenda. They should be telling us what it is that they need to thrive and succeed in the country. And we should be facilitating that as part of our efforts to be more inclusive.
I think that's a really important point, that immigrants should be included in the decisions that affect them, that surround them. And hopefully we can see more of that in the future. I want to move a little bit to asylum seekers and refugees, because you also discuss them in your book. Trump famously gutted asylum and refugee protections and organizations during his administration. What, if anything, has the Biden administration been doing to rectify that, especially given that 386,000 asylum seekers are caught in the backlog as of 2020?
Right. Well, as I do talk about in the book, I think the Trump administration policies on refugees and asylum were amongst the worst of those that were enacted, usually by executive action, but sometimes by regulation. I think you have to separate the two issues, though. One is the refugee resettlement program, and that there is a bit of a botched beginning in terms of the rollout of the Biden policies on that, but I think they're starting to get more on point. And those are situations where the US identifies refugees of special humanitarian concern to the US who are still abroad, and who are either referred by the UN Refugee Agency or by voluntary agencies within the US. The US has been the leader of the refugee resettlement program since the end of World War II, when we began to break through some of the national origins restrictions by having special programs for displaced persons, particularly from Eastern Europe. And certainly during the Cold War and even into the post-Cold War period, the US maintained quite high levels of refugee resettlement. They vary depending on need, but reflected an American commitment to ensure protection for those who couldn't go home, but also were in pretty bad situations in the country in which they first took refuge. We even resettle people from people who are still in their own country of origin, if resettlement will help save their lives or bring them into a better situation. That's very much under presidential discretion. I think we should set a statutory floor on those decisions so that we won't have what happened with the Trump administration, where the annual quotas or ceilings on admission were set so low during a period of massive displacement around the world that the US lost its credibility as a leader in finding solutions for refugees. So we have to have a continuing commitment in that area. That's doable, and I think the Biden administration is taking the steps now to do it. But because the resettlement program was so devastated, it's going to take quite a long time before we can get back up to the levels that were common in prior periods of time. The more tricky issue is asylum. That's where people come to our borders or enter the country, and then request permission to remain because they will be endangered if they return home under the current situation. As you mentioned, there are very, very large backlogs of asylum seekers that are at the court. And nothing new, by the way, because in the mid-1990s, we enacted immigration reform to deal with the extremely large backlogs in the asylum caseload. So it's something that does come every once in a while and becomes a much longer term problem because so many people are in the backlog. So first we need to deal with the backlog, and I think that that's going to require some legislative action in order to ensure that people who have been waiting for now years and years, had good cases when they came in, were found to have credible fear of persecution on return, which is why they ended up in the backlog to get a full hearing, to let them get through the system without having to go through a full asylum hearing. This is what we did in the 1990s, and we can do it again through that type of bipartisan at the time legislation. For the people who have been stuck on the US-Mexico border, I'm very grateful that President Biden has stopped the migration protection protocols that were otherwise known as the Remain in Mexico provisions. They were in such violation of both the spirit and the letter of refugee law internationally and domestically that they needed to be eliminated. But it leaves us with the question of how to deal with both those who came to the border over the last several years and are now able to come into the country, those large numbers, as well as new arrivals. And there, I think that we have to streamline the processing system. Good cases should be approved right at the border and not have to go through this labyrinth system of the immigration court if the case is strong enough. Cases which are not so strong or perhaps even extremely weak should then be sent immediately into the courts to have with all due process, have their day in court to determine whether they're refugees. Now, the biggest problem that we face, though, is that the refugee definition itself is very, very restrictive. It applies only to persons who are fleeing a well-founded fear of persecution, and only if that persecution is because of certain characteristics: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Many of the people who are claiming asylum don't fit that narrow definition, no matter how broadened you are in the way in which you implement it. There are people who are fleeing extreme economic harm, as is the case for many of the Venezuelans, because of a government that is corrupt and ineffective and has no respect for the rights of the people who live in the country, but is not necessarily persecuting them. Or the people who are coming in from Central America, who are maybe fleeing domestic violence or gang violence, many of whom should qualify for asylum. The Trump protestations to the contrary, but many of whom are really fleeing the generalized violence in the countries in the Northern Triangle, and that they won't qualify under our current refugee definition. So what we really need to do with our policy is to find complementary ways that we can afford protection to people who are facing life-threatening situations back home, but not necessarily persecution because of a protected characteristic. I think that we should have a system of temporary protection that could be offered on arrival. If those conditions don't change within a reasonable period, let's say 5 to 7 years, then they should have a pathway to return. To remain in the country in a permanent fashion. If the conditions change, then we should provide assistance for repatriation with help for them to reintegrate into their home communities with some safety and dignity. That's what we do for refugees when they repatriate. We should have something similar for people with temporary protection. But we can't have a system of what we have now with people with temporary protection for 2 decades, unable to get any type of legal permanent status. That again, it corrupts the system to make it so infeasible for people to integrate that they remain on the margins of society.
Do you think that the international community should expand the definition of what a refugee is?
Well, I think they should do it, but not by revising the Refugee Convention. I'm quite opposed to that. I think that they should certainly try to stretch it as much as possible in terms of the way it's implemented. But my worry, frankly, is that if the refugee definition was opened up, it would actually become more restrictive rather than more expansive. What I think we have to do is have these complementary pathways, ways people can find protection that are more specific to their needs. One form of protection should clearly be asylum and refugee status. But when people don't need it, we should still have mechanisms worldwide. And I would certainly would love to see a protocol that would set out what those complementary protections are. We've come closer to it with the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. There are provisions there, for example, on environmental migrants, people who are leaving because of environmental harm or the threat of climate change. And there are provisions in the compact that are encouraging governments to think through ways of offering some security for people who are in that situation, not by trying to push them into the refugee definition, but rather dealing with their situation, determining if this is a temporary issue because of a storm, a hurricane, cyclone, whatever, or is this a permanent situation because of rising sea levels or highly persistent drought or other things that are not going to change, even under the best climate change scenario. So I'd just be more innovative, more flexible with how to deal with the problem rather than fiddling around with trying to make everybody into a refugee.
That actually leads very well into my next question, which was on climate migration. Because this, you mentioned it towards the end of your book as well, and this is not something that only happens to islands in the Pacific or in other countries. It's happening in the US, it's been happening, and it will continue to happen as we have wildfires that get worse on the West Coast or hurricanes that are destroying the eastern coastline. So how prepared is the US to deal with climate displacement and migration within our own borders?
I'm not an expert in that area, so let me start with that. But having looked globally at what's happening on climate change and mobility, I think that no one is particularly well prepared for dealing with this issue. Again, our legal systems are not conducive to effective responses that would provide greater protection to those who are affected by climate change, US included. We have temporary protected status, but that's about the only mechanism that we really have, and that's quite a faulty one at present. In terms of what's important to keep in mind is that the vast majority of the people who are affected by climate change and who are likely to move are in developing countries, and they're going to move internally. No matter how challenging it is for the United States or the countries of the European Union or Australia or New Zealand, et cetera, Japan, we have the financial resources, we have the structures, the institutions to address them. It's the developing countries that are really in problematic situations because when the movements are internal, it'll be primarily the countries in which it's occurring that will need to step up. There isn't sufficient funding within the UN framework for the Climate Change Convention to support all of the adaptation and loss and damage programs that are going to be needed in order to help them survive this. I think what the US domestically should be doing is leading by example. We should be developing the frameworks and the legal capacities to deal with this issue in terms of internal movements through planned relocation programs. There are communities in Alaska that over the last decade and more have been asking for help from the federal and state governments to relocate because of the effects of the glacier melt and the rising sea levels. They want to move. They want to move as a form of adaptation. They want to move together. And so far, even though President Obama, for example, went to Alaska and pledged support and help in this process, there's no real mechanism for providing it. So we could, in dealing with our own challenges, become an example to the world in helping other governments figure out what it is that they could be doing in this sphere. We should also put up a whole lot more money for adaptation and for loss and damage to help other countries to prepare themselves. We could do it through the UN framework process, the UNFCCC, and put more money into those funds. We could establish more bilateral and regional approaches for addressing these. It's not only in their benefit to have more in the way of resources, but it's to our benefit as well. We're seeing in Central America, for example, that the beginning, the beginning signs of very serious effects of climate change are being felt. There's projections for quite a lot more internal migration. And we know that when there's internal migration in countries close to us, there's often a spillover into international migration. And so helping the countries in Central America to deal with their challenges responding to climate change is beneficial for them, but it also may help to reduce the number of people who are coming as distressed migrants rather than as coming through safe, legal, and orderly channels.
I think you raised a really good point that the US can be a positive example to the world on climate adaptation issues. Just in the same way, I was struck at the end of your book when you talked about how when you went to Kenya and it was during the Somali refugee crisis that the Kenyans pointed to that the US didn't let in Haitians during that crisis, and so why should they do what the US didn't do? So we really have the opportunity to lead by a positive example, and I hope that the US does that in the future. I'm sure that you saw yesterday that Kamala Harris was in Guatemala, and she gave a press conference where she said to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the US-Mexico border, do not come. The US will continue to enforce our laws and secure our border. We will discourage illegal migration. I believe if you come to our border, you will be turned back. So we have a question from the audience. How do we reconcile what President Biden said on the campaign trail with what Vice President Harris said in Guatemala yesterday about the US being full? Can the two be reconciled, or are we seeing a continuation of Trumpian rhetoric?
Okay, this has happened a lot in the past as well, where the US president or Secretary of State, Vice President has made strong statements saying don't come. Generally, it's not worked very well. People get their information from other sources, and they if they feel that there's no way to stay, that's the more likely scenario in which they're going to come, regardless of how they can make it. But I think that what the Biden administration is trying to do, aside from the rhetoric, is actually potentially quite useful. And that's to work on the causes in the countries that will help allow people to remain in place. The majority of people want to stay home. Only 3% of the world's population, a little over 3%, are international migrants. This is not something that the vast majority of the world's population wants to do. If you can stay home, you will stay home. Almost without exception on this. So taking the steps to allow people to remain home is much, I think, more effective. But that is a long-term solution. And so in the short term, I think what we have to have are mechanisms by which people can enter legally. I was glad that the Biden administration reopened the Central American Minors Program, which had been started under President Obama. President Trump closed it down on almost the first day in office. It was the only legal pathway by which many of the kids who were fleeing because of the circumstances that were affecting them, the gang violence and sometimes domestic violence, could get to the U.S. So I think we have to have a more robust mechanism for admitting people from inside the countries. Refugees, if they meet the definition, but through a parole program if they don't, by which the government can admit people because they're in serious humanitarian harm. That's that complementary type of status that I was talking about before. So if you provide more legal pathways and work on reducing the push factors and including corruption, because that unauthorized migration almost requires corruption in order to function because it's a violation of the rule of law. So if we work on those kinds of issues with the Central American governments and with Mexico as partners, not with threats, but with help, then I think that we'll have a lot more success in trying to manage the movements of people, helping those who really need to get out of harm's way and providing opportunities for those who could stay where they are.
So the administration, the Biden administration has given funding to security forces in Mexico and Central America to stop migrants, and they have increased funding to ICE. Is that the best way to address the roots of the problem?
No, I don't believe it is. Although I think that to the extent that we can buttress the Central American governmental capacities to manage movements of people, that's a benefit. So that I sort of separate, where we're putting the money in terms of what the aim is. It shouldn't be just closing borders. But if we can develop the capacity of the Mexican government to really run an asylum process that has due process, provides safety for people. People don't have the right to get to any particular place to get safety. They do have the right to get safety, though. And therefore, if we can provide safety in Mexico, I'm all for it. I think that that's a reasonable way of handling the situation. At present, that safety doesn't exist. And the migration, the protection protocols, the Remain in Mexico policy, demonstrated that that capacity wasn't there. Rather, people were living on the street. They weren't in situations with safe shelter where they had legal access to legal counsel, a way of being able to think through what their options were in a reasonable way. Nor was there a resettlement program from Mexico into the US so that people who did qualify could potentially either stay in Mexico with the legal status that would allow them to work and settle there, or be resettled into the United States. So there are things we can do that keep the border safe, but are not punitive in the way in which they're implemented. And that's where I think we need to be exploring with Mexico and with other countries in Central America, Costa Rica and Panama, for example, which have have quite a lot of Central American asylum seekers as well now, Venezuelans and others coming in from South America. We need a regional system for dealing with these kinds of problems. This is not just a US issue. It's an issue that is affecting the entire region. We have mechanisms like the Regional Migration Conference, where some regional approaches can be discussed, and perhaps a regional framework or even a regional convention that would state exactly what the responsibilities of each country will be, might be a good pathway so that it's not, that people aren't taking these dangerous routes in the hope that they're going to come in, but know that there's a way that they can find protection in a much safer manner.
I think it goes back to what you said in the beginning, where we can't be making these decisions and creating immigration policy in a vacuum, because every country has to work together, and it's just not going to work if we're all doing different things individually. Yep. I want to thank you so much for coming today, Susan. This was really, really great speaking to you. I learned a lot. Your book was super interesting, so I highly recommend everyone to read it if you want to learn more about immigration within the US and the history of immigration. And if you want to keep up to date on our events, please follow Newlines on Twitter and subscribe to our YouTube page. And once again, thank you so much, Susan.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.